Formula One tried something different with this year's Monaco Grand Prix, but it descended into manipulation, the words of Carlos Sainz, the Williams driver, and George Russell, who controversially cut the chicane to get ahead of one car, got a drive-through penalty and still benefited from it, said he appreciated trying something, but it clearly didn't work at all. John, we're going to get into that and why Russell felt the way he did, but coming back to Sainz's comment in particular, manipulation, strong word to throw around, and might seem a bit odd if you only judge the race on what happened at the very front, but further back it did get a bit controversial. So for starters, what was behind the manipulation that we saw?
This is really fascinating, because on Thursday when we spoke to Carlos Sainz, he talked about this two-stop strategy, and he said his concern was teams would play games. You'd use one car to back people up and open up gaps, and that's exactly what happened, and Williams did it in a much greater extent than anyone else. It was triggered by Isaac Hadjar and Liam Lawson at Racing Bulls. Lawson opened up a gap to draw Hadjar into it to protect his position, worked brilliantly, secured them, good bunch of points today. Opened the eyes to Williams, thinking, oh, our cars are together, we can do this. So Carlos Sainz backed up to give a gap to Alex Albon to get a pit stop. Alex Albon got his pit stop, came out in front, then they swapped positions. Carlos then shot up the road, Albon then backed up the cars behind him, and that's where the trouble came in. There was a train of cars behind him. Mercedes getting very, very frustrated at what was happening. George Russell, in his frustration, cut the chicane to get ahead so he'd take the penalty. But it's triggered a lot of kind of unhappiness from the drivers involved. Alex Albon, you mentioned as well, Carlos Sainz. James Vowles texted Toto Wolff during the race and apologised, said, I'm sorry. But I think Toto knew the games at play. But this was a scenario that teams knew could play out here in certain circumstances, and we saw it with three teams, because Mercedes themselves in the end did it too, with George Russell and Kimi Antonelli. Yeah,
it was a chain reaction. The Williams situation was effectively sparked by Racing Bulls, not just being inspired by it, but because of the way that what Racing Bulls did backed up the midfield, the entire midfield. Alex Albon being at the front of the train of cars behind Liam Lawson meant that to do their own mandatory pit stops and not lose position, Williams realised we're going to have to do this. Like they knew on Thursday, everybody knew on Thursday this was an option. Nobody really wanted to do it. It was just going to be as soon as someone pulled the pin, everyone had to follow. Russell pointed out he finished in a higher position by doing his manoeuvre with Alex than if he hadn't, and that in itself proves the system's pretty flawed. Well, John, I think it's fair to say it's flawed, but do you think it was a success or a failure? Because we've had 4 days of stress for the teams, intrigue, concerns about loopholes, nobody having a clue, pretty much until the race started, what they should do, because everybody's strategy was interwoven with what everybody else would do, what would happen during the race. So in a way, it added interest. It was theoretically a better spectacle than the one that we had last year. So was it flawed? Was it a failure? What's your view?
I think there were flaws in it, and this teammate issue is something that needs addressing, because I think this was the problem. But I think overall, it worked. I've sat here many years at Monaco's, and it's, unless the rain intervenes, the races aren't exciting. The leader backs the pack up, kind of builds a small gap up before the pit stop, has his pit stop, nothing happens, no excitement beyond safety cars. Today we had no safety cars, but we still had quite an exciting race at the front, I thought. A lot of more uncertainty, elements of jeopardy. We've had a weekend of shake-up in qualifying. So I think there are improvements to be made. The team issue needs to be sorted out. But I think ultimately, the biggest problem is Monaco, the tight confines of Monaco, do not produce good racing.
I'm a little bit less sort of optimistic about it overall. I don't think it worked in terms of making it a better race, because, and we're going to get into the fight at the front in a minute, it didn't really change anything fundamental. The finishing order in the top 10 was as it started. The journey to that was definitely more frenzied in a way, more controversial, it's more storied, we're talking about it after all. And I appreciate the point that this is Monaco, and Monaco's never a particularly good racing spectacle, but to quote a couple of the drivers, I don't think it created actual racing, and as Lando Norris put it, he doesn't want racing to be manufactured, and it felt like, yes, there was a bit more going on in this race, but it was quite contrived, and we've seen this happen in Monaco before when it's a one-stop, so I don't think you're ever going to eradicate that entirely. But I think, as Sainz pointed out, the fact that you had the mandatory two-stop meant everybody did it twice. Let's come on to the added stress it caused at the front. Even though the result stayed the same, I spoke to Andrea Stella, the McLaren team boss, who said that whether this was interesting or not is kind of subjective, and actually it was interesting for those at the front because there was a lot more going on. Oscar Piastri said it made it a bit more tense at a few points, even though ultimately it didn't change a whole lot. Charles Leclerc said it at least gives you hope that something is possible. Why did the race at the front play out exactly the same? Was there an opportunity for the two-stop to create a bit more jeopardy? Why didn't we see the tricks in the midfield at the front?
Well, partly because the cars at the front weren't in the right position to do it. You had Oscar Piastri and Lando Norris fighting for World Championship. And if you're having these teammates open up gaps and swapping positions, you can't have them fighting each other for place. They've got to work together. Laura Meckes from Racing Bulls told me tonight that they went into it accepting that Liam Lawson, the guy backing up, would potentially be sacrificed completely. The danger was completely out of the points. So he couldn't do it that. Ferrari couldn't do it because Lewis Hamilton was too far back, trapped behind Fernando Alonso, who was backing things up himself. So they were in a very difficult position. There's one interesting scenario, though, that Mercedes, from what we understand, if they had started 4th and 5th, 5th and 6th, had those cars together, their intention was to play out this strategy themselves. Their calculations are it potentially could have won them the race. And then I wonder tonight, would we be viewing that as a strategy masterstroke to have pulled off a genius move that won them the race? Would we be saying this is a ridiculous farce and it's all too manipulated?
Well, I know us too well. We'd have been very cynical about it. No, the Mercedes theory is a good one. And if you look at what Racing Bulls did, if they'd had the cars closer together, it's exactly what Williams did, and then what Mercedes ultimately did, but in the midfield, you're looking at a 1-2. If you can have the cars at the front of the grid and do that, but cynically, is that great strategy? Is that unethical? Is it against sporting integrity and so on? What I am slightly surprised by, and maybe they'll realise this on review, is there might have been a potential for McLaren to have turned this into a 1-2 by ultimately doing that strategy, but it would have depended on Ferrari and Charles Leclerc not following suit. And by that, what I mean is, if Lando Norris and McLaren had stayed out instead of pitting first of the leaders as they did, and they'd kept Oscar Piastri out as well, if they'd been able to wait out Charles Leclerc and Ferrari, so Leclerc eventually stopped, they'd have had the cars running 1 and 2, and then they could have played those games themselves. But there's lots of ifs, buts and maybes in that, because it doesn't matter if Leclerc doesn't follow suit. It didn't change anything for Red Bull, and Max Verstappen said that he could have done 2, 3, 4, 5 pit stops and it wouldn't have made a difference. I think he made a couple of other choice remarks as well about it, why not try some Mario Kart style throwing bananas. Christian Horner said it was an improvement and strategically more interested and with more jeopardy than what we saw last year. So in terms of what else F1 can do in Monaco, would you like to try this again to see if it's a one-off, or to see if everybody does the same, or if it does work if you give it another chance?
I think personally it's better than the one-stop races. I think the one-stop races around here just guarantee that it's going to be boring unless it rains. I think the problem is now everyone knows what the best tactic is to win it. Do we end up in a scenario next year where everyone does this? Any team that's got 2 drivers next to each other on the grid will elect to go and start on the hards, long as possible, shenanigans, and move forwards. I think the ultimate issue is they need to find a way to get an overtaking opportunity here. Whether it's trying to lengthen a DRS zone, finding some way to just introduce something that prevents teams backing off by 4, 5, 6 seconds at times. Because you can't police that. As Fred Vasseur said tonight, where does it stop? Do you say you can't back off by 3 tenths, half a second, 1 second, 3 seconds?
Well, that's the thing. If you're trying to apply basically a racing equivalent of the 107% rule that we have in qualifying, what do you deem to be an acceptable cut-off? What's the threshold for acceptably quick racing laps? And there are other things you could try and do, I guess, within the rules to do it, to try and make sure you separate teams' cars on track, whether that's by mandating that your cars, start on different tyre compounds, so you definitely can't run exactly the same strategy or whatever. Just to come back to Russell, another good quote of his, he was gold dust basically after this. He said, you could effectively put an F2 car out there and they've got a chance of holding up an F1 car. I don't know what the solution is. Do you think the main takeaway from this so far is that everybody here needs to kind of get their heads together and just see, actually, is there a better way to make Monaco interesting? Because it's nice that they've tried something, but it always felt to me like it was a little bit out of hope rather than expectation. So, there's some smart brains in this paddock. Does it just need a sort of deeper look at what they can do, even if it is, as you pointed out, finally doing something about the layout to create an overtaking space?
There is an interesting aspect here. Next year's technical regulation changes, gets rid of DRS. We've got the engine overtake manual override, which will allow cars to boost. We stick to the two-stop, we impose some specific regulations for Monaco, which will allow overtaking on the straights. If you get within a certain position, throw it up, mix it up a little bit, because the second that you can overtake, coming out of the tunnel into that chicane, for example, it changes everything. You can't play these games anymore. You'll be exposed, you'll drop back, and that would sort out the Monaco Grand Prix.